By January 1781, the American cause in South Carolina was on the verge of total collapse. The British had captured Charleston, taken over 5,000 prisoners, and left the surviving Patriot forces freezing, starving, and hiding in the backcountry. General Nathaniel Greene took command of the roughly 1,400 surviving Continentals and made a desperate survival calculation. To keep his fragile force from being wiped out entirely, he split the army in two, sending about 600 troops west. Hunting that western detachment was a British officer named Banastre Tarleton. He commanded over 1,000 of the best-trained, most aggressive soldiers in the British Army, moving relentlessly to crush the American remnants. Half of the men standing in Tarleton's way were untrained American militia. These were part-time soldiers and farmers carrying a well-documented reputation for dropping their weapons and sprinting for the woods at the first sight of a British bayonet charge. Traditional 18th century warfare required men to stand shoulder to shoulder in an open field and trade musket volleys. Asking terrified civilians to hold a static line against heavily armed professionals was a recipe for a slaughter. The militia were always going to run. The man leading those Americans was Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. He had no aristocratic connections and no formal military education. What he did have was a lifetime of backcountry brawls, scars from 500 lashes by a British officer, and a precise understanding of how ordinary men behave under fire. Morgan had watched militia panic and flee before. He understood that expecting untrained civilians to trade volleys with British regulars was a failure of capability, not character. They simply lacked the specialized training to withstand an organized wall of steel. Instead of ignoring that reality, Morgan built his entire battle plan around it. He knew his men would eventually run, so rather than ordering them to stand and die, he engineered their inevitable retreat into the bait for a massive tactical trap. This map shows Morgan's chosen battleground, a sloping cattle pasture called the Cowpens. It offered no dense forests to hide in, and right behind the American position sat a broad, unfordable river. To a traditional officer, it looked like a terrible place to mount a defense. Morgan placed his army here on purpose. By putting a river at their backs, he blocked their escape route. If the militia panicked and tried to flee early, they would drown. But Morgan didn't ask them to hold the line to the bitter end. The night before the battle, he walked from campfire to campfire with a highly specific request. Wait for the British to close in, fire 2 aimed volleys, and then they were free to turn around and walk away. He gave them permission to leave. By replacing a suicidal stand with a manageable, temporary task, Morgan removed the panic from the equation. Every man knew exactly what to do to leave the field with his honor intact. This profile view diagram shows how Morgan organized his forces in 3 deliberate lines across the terrain. The first line was a thin screen of frontier sharpshooters positioned far out front. Their only job was to target the men on horseback and assassinate the British officers giving orders. About 150 yards behind them sat the bait. This was the main militia force. Their orders were to deliver those 2 aimed musket volleys at 50 yards, then turn to the left and circle entirely around the back of the American formation. Waiting exactly where that militia would retreat was the anvil, 450 heavily armed Continental regulars. Morgan positioned them slightly behind the first low rise, hiding them in a topographical blind spot so the approaching British couldn't see them. Finally, tucked entirely out of sight behind a second hill, Morgan hid the hammer. Roughly 120 cavalrymen under the command of William Washington sat waiting for the exact right moment to strike. This layered defense was designed to exploit Tarleton's aggression. The British commander's belief that American militia would always crumble under a fast assault became the very mechanism that pulled his army into the trap. Tarleton arrived at dawn after marching his men through the freezing darkness. Believing he had cornered a trapped, outnumbered force, he ordered an immediate all-out attack without waiting to rest his troops or scout the terrain. The British advanced directly into Morgan's script. The American sharpshooters dropped several officers right away before falling back. The redcoats pressed on, hitting the main militia line, which leveled their muskets, fired 2 devastating volleys at 50 yards, and calmly turned to retreat. Watching the militia pull back, Tarleton made his fatal error. He saw the panic he expected. Assuming the American line had broken, the British officers lost control. Their disciplined soldiers surged into a blind, full-speed sprint up the hill. This tactical map shows the moment the trap snapped shut. The screaming mob of British infantry crested the hill and slammed directly into the hidden line of rested, organized Continental regulars. At point-blank range, the Continentals delivered a massive volley, followed by a brutal bayonet charge, stopping the British dead in their tracks. At that exact second, Washington's hidden cavalry thundered out from behind the second hill, tearing into the exposed British right flank. On the left side of the field, the returning militia, having completed their loop around the back, reappeared with loaded muskets to hit the British left flank. The British were hit from the front, the right, and the left. By trusting his men to do one simple job, a backcountry fighter with no formal training had successfully orchestrated a textbook double envelopment against a professional European army. The battle was over in an hour. Morgan destroyed the elite British tactical force, killing, wounding, or capturing 80% of Tarleton's men. The Americans lost just 12 dead. The material loss was severe, but the psychological blow was worse. Cowpens permanently shattered the British core strategic assumption that American militia would always break under pressure. General Cornwallis was furious. Desperate to avenge the loss and catch the retreating Americans, he actually burned his own supply wagons to lighten his army for a high-speed pursuit north into Virginia. That aggressive chase stretched Cornwallis's supply lines to the breaking point. He exhausted his troops, pulled them far from their support bases, and ultimately backed his unraveling army into a small tobacco port called Yorktown, where he would be forced to surrender. Morgan didn't secure that victory by wishing for perfectly disciplined soldiers. He looked honestly at the farmers and shopkeepers he had, accepted their exact limitations, and used the enemy's own hubris to seal the trap.